Hello, beautiful people, and thank you for joining me on my channel, The Spiritual OT. I am thrilled to be joined today by an old friend of mine, Bree Ridgeway, who is here to talk with me all things neurodiversity, late diagnosis, and generally to share some of her experiences about what it's like living in our world today, and being a powerful part of what I've kind of coined as the neurodiversity affirming movement. So thank you so much, Bree, for being here and for sharing your story with us.
You're more than welcome.
So can you tell me a bit about you? What do you do? Who are you? What do you love? Let us get to know you a little bit.
So I'm Bree. This is probably a bit trite to start with professions and whatnot, but I'm a
It's okay.
33-year-old lawyer. Um, I'm just passed the bar exam, so I'm going to the bar later on this year.
Congratulations.
Thank you. I live up in the hills with my husband, in this beautiful place called Sassafras, which is delightful. It's surrounded by a bunch of national parks, which I really love, and my animals. I'm a big animal person, particularly cats, of which I have three. Um, Anyone who follows me on Instagram knows that that's about 90% of what I talk about and take pictures of. um, I mean, yes, that's probably it in a nutshell. I should probably
So,
also say I'm autistic, so yeah.
and you're autistic.
And I'm autistic.
Um, what do you love to do? What sort of lights you up? What are your passions and hobbies and things like that?
So my primary love is sleeping. Once I've got that out of the way, um, I take a lot of joy in being outside. And sport, I like running. I'm not very good at running, but it's something that gives me a lot of peace. Um, I like I like learning a lot. Um, you can sort of find me just trawling through things on Wikipedia for the hell of it. Regurgitating bits of fun facts for my friends and family who are, thankfully, I hope, appreciative of that. Um, and yeah, and my pets. I've got three cats, two dogs, and a snake, and they are all brilliant.
Oh, that's fantastic. Yeah, I love animals too. That's such a huge part of my life. Sometimes
Mm,
I feel like animals can be so much easier to relate to than people.
mm. Well, that was one of the things that really, I think, it resonated for me when I was sort of just diagnosed, was that with people saying that cats often behave a lot like autistic people. It's very much, they have their own person. They've got a lot of, very similar, like, sensory needs to people. They love touch, but only on their own terms,
Yes.
um, and that kind of thing. And it sort of, I think that helped me relate to my cats a lot more when I read that.
That's such an interesting reflection, isn't it? Because, if you do compare like cats and dogs, it's like the dogs are the ones that are like trying to be like socially pleasing and they're like, really like
Mm,
engaged with everyone and blah, 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 blah. And then the cats are just kind of like, is this for me? No, I'm not so sure. Like
yeah,
that individuality really comes out.
yeah. My cats do not care at all about what is socially pleasing, but they are, I think, like, in many ways, far more loyal than certainly than my dogs. Like,
Yeah.
my dogs will give it up for anybody, whereas my cats have picked me and I'm their person.
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, I love them all equally, of course. Not really.
I love that.
Yeah.
Yeah. So tell me, what was it like? What was your childhood like? What was growing up like for you?
So I was an only child. My parents were teachers, which I think it had very much good things and bad things for growing up autistic, because they were incredibly encouraging of my special interests. So every time I had some quirky obsession, that was something that they were really, really, really keen to promote and to let me really run with it, which was, it was fantastic, because a lot of those special interests were where I started getting confidence to, do things like speaking or performing or socializing. And I think that's something that a lot of autistic people don't necessarily get that opportunity as much, particularly if, it's something that they're good at. They're being told, stop doing that because you're doing it so much that it's weird. And often that's, it's kind of robbing them of the opportunity to know what it's like to be, really good at something in the middle of a group of people who are really keen on that thing, or and to get that confidence that comes with, like, having really excelled at something. It was a bit tough at times because they were very, they always wanted me to be better, and there were some things that I was not very good at as a child and as an adult as well. So it sort of always surprised me as I come across people later in life who don't who don't think it's such a terrible shortcoming that I happen to be disorganized or, forgetful or whatnot.
Yeah.
And when I sort of come across that kindness now, it always sort of takes the wind out of me a little bit, because the message that I got very much growing up was like, you need to improve at this. But it was overall a pretty good environment growing up. I didn't really have a great time at school because I was sort of noticeably weird, and I would be very surprised if there are a lot of autistic people that said they had an amazing time in school and they were just accepted and everyone thought they were fantastic. Like, that's teenagers are awkward and growing and learning, and that goes for the autistic ones and the non-autistic ones as well. So it's a bit of a it's a bit Hunger Gamesy.
Yes. I completely resonate with that. Yeah.
Yeah.
But I love that you identified there that in having your special interests really fostered and nurtured, it actually gave you the opportunity to build confidence. And I think, as we move more into strengths-based approaches in therapy, in parenting, in teaching, we're trying to encourage everyone to take children's strengths and people in general, right? Let's not even talk about children, but like all people, their strengths and their interests and the things that intrinsically motivate them. And that's where we can give purpose and meaning and connection. And I think it's beautiful how you sort of identified that in you being able to have that encouraged, like whatever it was that was your thing, anything that you might have found a passion in or whatever, that was encouraged. And like you said, you were able to find almost like a sense of belonging within other people who shared that interest.
And it's like, I think in school, your peer group is limited to the people that were sort of born within 12 months of you. But then, and maybe you're the only kid that's interested in jazz music when you're 14. But then, when you become an adult and you go off and, you want to join a band, or you want to play Dungeons and Dragons, or you want to join a basketball team or something, the pool of people who might share that interest is so much wider. And I think that's a real gift to have, is to be sort of permitted to really run with that stuff that makes you happy, because it might make you a bit weird in high school, but the utility of it when you've left is great.
Yeah. So what were some of those things for you, like when you were a child and growing up? What are those things that really like lit you up and brought you purpose?
I had a range of obsessions. When I was when I was in primary school, I was really obsessed with Shakespeare. My ninth birthday party was Shakespeare themed, and I remember getting really, really mad at one of my friends because he dressed up as Leonardo DiCaprio from the recently released Romeo plus Juliet Baz version, and I
Yes.
was really angry at him because he didn't come in the like traditional Elizabethan gear that I had, as a 9-year-old Shakespeare purist, expected all of my friends to adhere to. Um, and and then there was Greek mythology, and then there was Lord of the Rings, and then there was Harry Potter, and and then in high school, music was a really big one for me. But just it was they didn't always stick around. And I think after, after I'd sort of like done with one special interest and moved on to the next one, often I sort of looked back with a bit of shame about, oh my God, I really got a bit too far into that. I was what we would now describe as so cringe. But I think now that I've got a bit more compassion for myself, particularly of my 9-year-old self, um,
Yeah.
it's nice to be able to look back and be like, I really enjoyed that. Like, I really enjoyed getting very sucked into learning what each of the Shakespeare plays was about and in which order they were written and who all the characters were, um, and all of that kind of yeah, just that stuff.
Sounds like there's almost like a theme of like this like magical or like make believe realm of things that really sort of struck your interest when you were younger.
Yeah, yeah, certainly there was. I think I've read that that's pretty common with female autistics, that often your special interests aren't as stark and sort of massy as the ones that you see represented in the media. It's a lot more, you get into something that everyone else around you is a bit into, but you get into it a lot.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
um,
yeah. Yeah. So, in terms of like whether it be at home or even at school, like I know there's a lot coming out at the moment around how schools could be far better supporting, autistic people, neurodivergent people, whatever it might be. When you look back at your sort of schooling, do you think there are ways, in what ways were you well supported, do you think? And in what ways do you think perhaps you could have been better supported?
I think the ways that, the school that I went to and the amount that my parents invested sort of with their, with money, but also with a lot of time in taking me lessons. And my mum was an English teacher, so she spent a lot of time talking about literature with me after school and tutoring me and that kind of thing. Um, and that sort of like really enriching, the music classes. That kind of enrichment was really helpful to make sure I didn't get bored and lose interest in school. But one of the things which I think my parents and probably to a greater extent my teachers really struggled with or just weren't aware of was the spiky profile.
Mm,
And something that I had to deal with from a really young age was the reactions of adults where they expected me to be, they noticed that I was particularly good at writing or reading, and therefore they expected that all of my skills would be on par with that. And when I fell short in something like remembering to do my homework or packing the right clothes or, you know, doing anything consistently, it was, they were really disappointed, and it was sort of put on me as very much a moral failing rather than a skill to be learned. And I
mm,
think that sort of recognition of that executive dysfunction as a, it's just the same as not being particularly good at maths or not being particularly good at sport or English or any other sort of academic skill, rather
mm,
than it being sort of this, um, separate moral skill that means you're a bad person as well as being a bad student.
mm,
Um, and if they'd had, if someone had been able to sort of sit down with me in a really non-judgmental way and give me some of the tips and tricks that I've got now to help me work through executive dysfunction, that would have been really helpful, because those kinds of skills I've basically had to learn from scratch as an adult
mm.
through trial and error
Yeah.
and occasionally internet chat rooms, as opposed to just being like, this is how you set a study program, and you've got a built-in buffer for if you skip a few nights or And just sort of approach that very non-judgmentally. I think that would have really, really helped in school.
Yeah. So it's almost like there's this stigma around intelligence, because I hear a lot of people these days getting the whole, oh, you're too smart to be autistic, or, you're too successful to be autistic or whatever. And but it's like that splintered skill set, I think, that isn't recognized because there's so much assuming that goes on, an expectation, right? That if you're excelling in one area, then everything else is fine. And therefore, if you do fall behind in an area, then that must be a choice, or it must be for lack of trying, because we know you can do well in this other area. Um,
Yeah.
do you think that had an
And
impact on how you see yourself?
yeah, certainly. Because it was, it was a huge amount of guilt and shame that I was carrying that I didn't have to be carrying. And that has, I've sort of gone through, and I'm still going through a process of shedding. Um, and yeah. I can't speak for what it would have been like to be growing up and having like serious learning difficulties when it comes to maths and English and all the stuff that I was fine at school. Maybe there is equally an amount of shame that comes with that is hard to shake when you're an adult. But thinking of yourself as lazy for a really long time, particularly when you're trying, is it takes a toll. There's sort of a goal as well. I mean, I'm very academically motivated. I've gone through this process in my 20s almost to collect as many qualifications as I can, with with the aim of, if I get to a certain point of success, then no one will be able to question my failings, because I'll be thought of as an absent-minded professor as opposed to a lazy girl who just doesn't like doing homework. And in many ways that's motivating, but in many ways it's also a bit sad. Like, it would probably be a lot better for me if I could just sort of do that stuff because I enjoy it.
Yeah, I resonate with that. I feel like I remember thinking when I was younger that, like, when I had my first degree, then I would be enough. And then it was like, once I had my second degree, I would be enough. And then, it was when I contemplated doing a PhD that I was like, why are you doing this? Are you actually doing it because you're really passionate about this? Or are you actually doing it because you think then you'll be enough? But it's never going to be enough, right? Because we already are fundamentally. And I think that's where this shedding that you mentioned before kind of comes into it, when we start rediscovering ourselves. So I suppose that leads me into this kind of topic of masking and then exploring a diagnosis and then like unmasking. Do you think that was sort of a process that you went through?
Yeah, I mean, I still mask a lot, but I'm a lot more conscious of it now, and I acknowledge what, I can sort of read how that affects my energy a lot better than I used to be able to. And one of the things is there's a lot of things I think that I found growing up being quite late diagnosed, because I was self-diagnosed at 26 and then formally diagnosed at 28, where there are a whole lot of like little Easter eggs in your life where you could have had a bit of self-realization, but you're misdirected by particularly the way autism presents in the media. And one of the things that reflected that for me was this idea that autistic people are really good actors because we're constantly mimicking those people around us. And that was a bit of a misdirection for me, because I think the first time I read that, I was just like, well, I'm a terrible actor, so that can't be me. But when I sort of paid a bit more attention to what I was doing and the degree to which I'd be sort of, adopting the style of speaking of the person that I was talking to, or the tone of my voice, or just, the kinds of things that I'd raise in conversation,
Yeah.
versus the things that I would, really hesitate to mention. It became apparent. I was like, oh God, I do this, I do this all the time, even at home, even with people who, I feel quite sort of physically safe around. Because another big thing was sort of learning to differentiate between, the word safe being used to describe not being in physical danger, and the word safe to mean, someone that I can, I can speak to in perhaps a really monotone voice for a long time, and they're
Mm.
not going to think there's something wrong with me, or and that sort of discovery and slow sort of like unmasking for people who were safe, and spending a lot more time by myself as well, it led me to realize exactly how much energy was taken up, um, and what that kind of energy meant. So like before I was diagnosed, I used to think of energy as this, you lose it when you stay up way too late or you exercise, and that's the only way to run out of energy.
Yeah.
But the diagnosis sort of started making me think, well, when I have a really big social, like a party or something, and then the next day I can only really talk in short sentences and I forget things all the time,
Mm.
realizing that there was, that was because I'd sort of, my brain was really tired from whatever the activity was, um, and that I needed to regain that energy, and that there was a real physical impact of running out of that kind of energy, that I couldn't talk properly, that I'd forget things that I'd used to, like particularly at work. My job requires me to be able to hold on to lots of bits of information and weigh them against each other and remember how something might relate to a new development and all that kind of thing. And I went from that to, barely being able to focus on what was in front of me.
Mm.
And so it was a really, really big step, sort of beginning to take that kind of energy seriously, and to take actions to conserve my mental energy. And yeah, it was the difference between trying to, live my entire life in first gear, even on a freeway, to
Mm.
learning that there are other gears, and that if I just managed it a little bit better, there were just so many improvements in every aspect of my life.
Did you find at any point that the people around you struggled to understand perhaps why you might be making some of those changes, or couldn't, like, especially people who didn't perhaps have an understanding of autism or of neurodivergence or of things like this, perhaps not being able to see why you were doing it?
Oh, completely. There, and in fairness to them, the amount of misconceptions that I came to my position with was
Mm.
high. So I, would be it would be a bit hypocritical if I were to turn around and complain about everyone around me not having an in-depth understanding um, of autism. But changes I was making, like wearing earmuffs, and I had it. My office, I had the light turned off for quite a long time, because the light bothered me, and I don't think no one ever came to my face and said, I what on earth are you doing? You're being so weird. I don't believe you have autism. I think you're making it up. And, why are you taking the light bulbs out in your office?
Yeah.
But you can tell by, sort of the raised eyebrows and, small comments that people make, that they did not get it. But
Mm.
I found that a lot of the time, just sort of persisting with it, um, they just sort of either accepted it or stopped caring after a while. So,
Yeah.
um, yeah, it was a lot of a lot of the people that I told and disclosed to for the first time were very, very surprised, very disbelieving, and that was disheartening. But most of them have come around.
Yeah. it's funny, a lot of women in particular that I have spoken to who are autistic have, especially those who were late diagnosed, felt that they spent so much time, masking in a way to fit in or to please other people in order to feel safe.
Mm,
And then so people kind of develop an idea of you, or like a picture of you that is not who you really are. And then so when you're like, oh,
mm,
hey, I found who I really am now and I kind of want to be this person, people are a bit like, hey,
mm.
you know? Um,
Yeah,
but I
that
think
was
it's
really
it's
sorry.
really interesting to kind of shed the light on um this idea that when we want to advocate for ourselves to make ourselves comfortable, it's so
Mm,
interesting how even when that doesn't affect anyone else, like taking the light out or wearing, earmuffs or
mm,
whatever, people find that to be um
mm,
I don't know whether the word triggering is too strong a word, but like somehow
mm,
affects them because it's not what's expected. And I feel like this is something I also would love to see shift a little bit in society, is that why do we have this little pigeonhole of how
mm,
people should be behaving?
mm,
And I think it's shifting more in children and in our therapy with children, as an OT myself working in pediatrics, a lot more is coming to light about children's needs and sensory needs and stuff like that, but it's not necessarily translating so much into adulthood and adults being able to have the same accommodations.
yeah, like it's almost a political question to ask, how does this affect you when someone um asks for something or identifies in a particular way? And I kind of think we should be, it's the sort of thing we should really be celebrating. Like if people can make a
Mm,
really positive change or have something that doesn't cost anyone anything,
yeah.
that is a way better, it's a way better situation than something that is actually going to take away from other people. So it is, yeah, it's a bit discombobulating when people react so strongly to, wanting to keep the status quo, despite the fact that an adjustment to the status quo doesn't have any impact upon them at all. Um, when you sort of look at it in comparison to ways that really could be impacting upon them,
Yeah.
um, it's quite surprising. And it certainly feels a bit hostile. I know there was an article that was published a week or two ago in the UK about it was a guy who was having a bit of a whinge about the amount of people who are being diagnosed with ADHD these days, and it
Mm.
was very much like, oh, back in my day this wasn't a thing. Um, but it was, yeah, it was really strange. He just took so much umbrage at the fact that people were just getting help, like, um,
Yeah.
and it's a common
Yeah. And you
age.
think, how does that affect you?
Mm,
Like, do you know what I mean? It's a bit like,
yeah.
what real difference does it make in
Mm.
that instance? Um, but I have to ask you to share your earmuff story.
Oh yes. Um, so I had and I think this goes to how just, the preconceptions people have about autism, particularly, I mean, I don't know if my gender had anything to do with it, but this idea that, autism is a developmental issue that affects children and then miraculously just disappears in adulthood, rather than, there being actually quite a lot of autistic adults out there who just
Mm,
aren't necessarily getting a lot of support. Um, but I was working at a place for a while where there was a building going on next door, and the noise was really, really distracting for me. So I went to Bunnings to get a pair of earmuffs. And the Bunnings assistant came up to me in the aisle and was asking me, "What are you looking for?" And I said, "Oh, earmuffs." And he said, "Oh, what do you need the earmuffs for?" And my response is, "Oh, autism." And he just said to me, "Oh no, we don't have these for children." And it was so confusing, because I was in the moment. I was like, do I need to now come out to this guy as autistic myself and
mm,
educate him on the spot about the fact that it doesn't just, disappear when you get your driver's license and turn 18?
yeah.
Um, but yeah, there's been quite a lot of instances like that where it's, I think there's a lot of people out there who, just because they haven't necessarily come across it very often in their
Yeah,
own lives, assume that it's just a childhood thing, assume that it's a male thing because that's what we see in the media.
yeah.
Um,
And I think when we were at school, obviously we went to school together, we weren't aware of people who were autistic within our cohort. It wasn't something people spoke
not
about.
never, yeah.
Um,
Mm,
I don't think I was aware of autism at all. I honestly don't think I was aware of it until I was a teenager, like well into my teens.
mm,
Um, and now I think as it's becoming more recognized and, neurodivergence in general, um,
mm,
obviously we're getting these late diagnoses because of course these people have always existed. There has always
mm,
been different neurologies and people growing up with their brains
mm,
functioning slightly differently. Um, but I think our systems, whether it's our education systems, our political systems, our social systems, just funneled this
mm,
neurotypical, again, not that that was really a term used, but way of functioning and a way of learning, way of socializing, whatever. And perhaps that's because it is the more prevalent
mm,
neurology or presentation. Um, but I think you're absolutely right that there are people who have never come into contact with adult neurodivergence because it seems to be such a booming thing in children now,
mm.
you know?
Yeah, and a lot of the late diagnosed adults have a choice to make about disclosure, whereas,
Mm.
and I guess children do too. But if you've been, if you know you're autistic from when you're very young, and if you've been raised autistic, and that's something you did, you've been through your teenage years with that as part of your identity, I think it's going to, mentioning it to your first employer is going to be a breeze when you know,
Mm.
however old you are when you get your first job. But um, like the last couple of times I've told my employer about my neurotype, it was like weeks of thinking and stress beforehand and trying to figure out how to approach it, and not wanting to approach it in a way that made it seem like I was imposing or asking for anything. And it was um and I've very deliberately wanted to be open about my neurotype, um but it's not an easy thing necessarily to do, and there are a lot of people who make the choice not to disclose. So even if they are diagnosed and they're fully aware of what's going on, it's not necessarily the case that they'd share that. um,
Why did you feel strongly about wanting to disclose it?
I think one of the things that made me a bit sad when I started, my when I self-diagnosed and then got diagnosed, was that there was no one I knew who was older than me who was autistic, and
Mm.
um, sort of examples of people who had autism and they'd still got to do what they wanted to do and they were still successful. They were so few and far between, that I I kind of felt like I didn't want the people coming after me to want to do law and want to be a lawyer, but were harboring a belief that you couldn't be a good lawyer if you had autism. And I sort of felt like if I had the mental, if I had the spoon, so to speak,
Yeah.
um, and the energy to be able to be open about it, which is something that a lot of people, don't. Like, it's so understandable that people would be like, yep, that's a great goal, to want to be able to be an example for the next generation, but it will take up 50% of my headspace, and I just don't have enough time and energy to do
Yeah.
that while also surviving.
Yeah.
Um, and yeah, but I didn't, like, there is so little representation of sort of adult, successful female autistic women, that I thought it would be, I thought it was important.
I think that's so admirable. And, I really resonate with that. And part of why I wanted to give people this platform to share, their stories is for that exact reason that I think we need to sort of continue to break the stigma around how being autistic always has to be a negative thing.
Mm.
Which leads me to another question. Do you think that there are parts of your autistic presentation that have actually been a real strength for you in pursuing, your career and your dreams and things that you wanted to
Oh,
achieve?
yeah, definitely. I got as part of my selection from the autism buffet, I got a really big helping of hyperfocus and really big helping of long-term memory, pattern recognition,
Yeah,
and those things are absolutely invaluable to to what I do, to be able to sort of to remember bits of information that were like we work with court books, and they might be
yeah,
3,000 pages long. To be able to read something halfway down the page and say, actually, I think that conflicts with something that I read 1,000 pages ago,
yeah,
is really, really helpful. There's a lot of, I mean, some of the study that I've done has been optional, but there's a lot of study that is not optional, and just being able to digest that much information and apply that much information to exam problems, and then problems that like a real life actual cases and that kind of thing,
mm,
um, is something that I think my autism plays a really, really helping hand in being able to do. And honestly, I don't know how, like I sat the bar exam at the end of last year, and it is an absolute monster of an exam. There's so much information to digest, and I honestly do not know how those poor neurotypicals manage to like digest that much information and regurgitate it as need be, because I was relying so heavily on my autism to get me through that.
yeah.
Um,
And this ties in so
mm,
beautifully to what you were saying before about like having your interests and your skills fostered in childhood, around music and around
mm,
your special interests, and then now being able to recognize that those same traits, like the hyperfixation and things like that, have been huge assets to you, particularly in the job that you're doing and the job that you want to do. Um, and I feel like this is where if we start recognizing the autistic gifts, as I like to call them, earlier on and fostering that in children, finding ways to better
mm,
support that through the education system, to recognize the splintered skill set and be able to accommodate that,
mm,
um, then we give all children, like regardless of their neurotype, the opportunity to follow their strengths, because I think where our strengths and interests are when we're young are kind of like where that purpose driven
mm,
sense comes from. Um, and if we sort of give children the opportunity to succeed in whatever it is that's their strengths based, rather than having that deficits based approach where it's like, oh, this is what's wrong with you, so we're going to fix this.
mm,
Seeing where the gifts are and where, the autistic mind has so many geniuses, like these capabilities. They say they suspect that Einstein and
mm,
Tesla were, all neurodivergent brains that created amazing things that have changed our whole lives. If we didn't have people with those capacity, would we be where we are? It's
mm,
like we need those people who are like the mold breakers and the change makers for
mm,
us to continue to develop. Um,
mm,
yeah. So I find it interesting though, like you decided to become a lawyer. Um,
mm.
was this something that you were always interested in? Or like where do you think this sort of stems from in terms of your interests and passions?
Oh no, not at all. I was definitely not always interested in the law. I my pathway to the law was that there were very high expectations of me in school academically, and therefore I fixated on the idea in my brain that it was law or medicine, and I wasn't particularly good at science. I'd sort of abandoned it halfway through school to do languages instead.
Mm-hmm.
So that was out. And I got this idea in my 18-year-old brain that if I didn't do law, I was academically not living up to my expectations. And so I decided I needed to be in law. But then I did some work experience working in a law firm, and I really enjoyed that. And I think I'm lucky that the pathway that I sort of mandated for myself actually did come with a lot of things that I really, that I get a lot of joy in, like particularly in my current job and in the work that I'll be doing when I go to the bar. It's a lot to do with, really heavily researching something and being really, really comprehensive and sure of your position. And really getting to the nitty-gritty of a particular area of law as it applies to a particular set of facts. And that's something that I love. Like I love that kind of analysis. I get excited about being given a task like that. And in that way, I think that it's a really good fit. But it's not a fit that I sort of prophetically saw when I was 17. I was just literally doing what I thought I was being told. So yeah.
Do you think you would do anything differently if you had your time again?
I don't know. I think I mean, I might end up in I would probably end up in a similar profession, but I think that a lot of the bullshit, so to speak, I hope this is not a G-rated channel, would have been sort of wiped out of the way. Like a lot of the decisions that I've made about what area of law I want to practice in and what kind of practice I want to have been more informed by what I now understand are my own strengths and weaknesses, and also the kinds of the things that you don't think about when you're an 18-year-old law student. Like what kind of clients do you want to have? Do you want to work for people or corporations or entities, or do you want to do short, sharp litigation, or do you want to do litigation that lasts 5 to 10 years? Like those bits of information, if I had an understanding about them, I probably, when I was 18, I probably would have directed myself to, to being like, well, is that area going to lead me to do the kind of work that I want to do, as opposed to, all the kids who seem really successful are keen on doing this. So I guess I should just trot on too. But I mean, I don't know if that's a specifically autistic thing. I think that's probably all adults need to figure out what their strengths and weaknesses are and what they like doing and try and direct themselves accordingly. I think that's probably just sensible advice.
Yeah.
I probably would have also, been a lot kinder to myself and a lot more constructive in my criticism of myself.
Yeah. I think self-compassion is such a huge thing that's just missing in humanity as a whole, right? Like people are just so hard on themselves, I think, in general. And I think there are, for myself especially, in my process of like unmasking and everything, the light bulb moments, especially around self-compassion and being able to see myself almost as someone else, like how would I treat another person who had that experience or whatever? And I'd be like, oh, I'd be so empathetic or whatever. And it's like, well, hello, why is it different for yourself? And I think it's almost a skill that sometimes we have to like learn how to actually hold self-compassion. And initially it can be really uncomfortable.
And I think really one of the one of the things that really resonated for me when one of my psychologists was talking me through self-compassion was just like the logic of it. Like what are you achieving by being really critical of yourself and beating yourself up? Is that actually motivating you to do better? Because it's not. Whereas like look at all of the if what you're motivated by is, doing well at work or succeeding at your exercise regime or whatever, and you want to see those kinds of results, this is actually a much more efficient path to get there, and it's a lot more enjoyable as well. Like you're not and I think that, I mean, that's it's very mechanical, but that's something that when I catch myself really, beating myself up for just not being different to the way that I am,
Mm.
it's been a very useful tip to just be able to say, what are you actually achieving by beating yourself up about this?
Yeah.
Nothing. You're making it worse.
Yeah. Do you have a particular like event or like memory or something that's occurred, in your life or in your process of diagnosis or whatever that has sort of shifted the way you show up, like as a neurodivergent person or whatever, whether it be in your personal life or work or
It was actually somewhat recently, like last year, we so I work at I work in the smack bang in the middle of the legal precinct in Melbourne, which is an area that is the stronghold of the status quo. There's a lot of history and etiquette and normality and neurotypicalness that sort of inhibits that place. And I think probably everyone under the age of 40 who works there have pretty significant imposter syndrome, which for me directly relates to autism. I find out that I'm autistic, and then despite everything I've done, they're going to think I'm not competent.
yeah.
That's a big fear. But part of the way through last year, there was the City of Melbourne did like a mural, a mural program around Melbourne, and they put one right outside the front of court, next to the coffee shop that everyone who's anyone in court and in the legal profession goes to this particular coffee shop. And it was this huge mural about neurodiversity and autistic acceptance.
Mm.
And I just remember like the first day that I rocked up to work and that was there, and I was just like, oh my God, City of Melbourne has commissioned something, openly accepting of autism in the middle of this place, and now I get to see it every morning on my way to work, like in this absolute stronghold of neurotypicalness.
Yeah.
And it was so beautiful. Like I was in tears when I went to work, and it was very difficult to explain to my co-associate at the time, saying like, I'm just really moved by the fact that this mural exists, and it is where it is. And then unfortunately a few months later, someone graffitied it in graffiti that was pretty specific to the message that was being that the mural was trying to convey. So the mural was all about, like, accept yourself, take your own time, neurodiversity is beautiful. And the graffiti was, I think, done by someone who was probably neurodiverse themselves, and they had had a pretty crappy experience of being supported. And so they'd written all over the mural in font that was very similar to, to make it look like the actual artwork, saying like, no, this is all bullshit. Your psychobabble won't make me unhomeless and that kind of stuff. And that was really devastating to read. But what was really beautiful was that at the time I'd sort of come out to a lot of people that I worked with, and a lot of those people wrote to the city council saying, please remove the graffiti. And it was just that kind of like camaraderie that I had not experienced before. That was really, it made it feel like it wasn't just something that was getting swept under the rug. It was really beautiful.
Yeah, it's like it comes back to that power of connection. I think so many people who um are autistic or neurodivergent in any way have found it difficult to have that connection because there's this idea of separation,
Mm.
when we're all actually looking for connection, but it just can be in different ways that's more comfortable for us.
Yeah,
And how beautiful for you to be in an environment that has typically been quite, pigeonholed,
yeah,
and then to have the people around you step up and really support you in such a vocal way, like to be actually advocating for you to like the city council. And um I think that's such a beautiful thing, and I love that that experience gave you a sense of, well, I can have space held for me,
Mhm.
and whichever way I show up,
Yeah,
even in a part of the world that looks like it may be quite stigmatizing or
mm.
set in their ways, so to speak.
Yeah. Oh, it was yeah, it was really yeah, it just meant so much at the time. Because it's very, like, there's a lot of sort of differences people have that they're very happy to talk about, particularly in the law. Autism is one where, like, you don't want to give off any impressions that something might be wrong with your brain.
Yeah, of
Your job
course.
relies very heavily on your brain. So the fact that, yeah, they were so accepting, and so that we're about to be joined by this
Hello.
is Asha. Get off. Um, yeah, the fact that it was, yeah, it was really, yeah, it meant so much. I'd not had that experience or anything like it beforehand. Um, it was beforehand, it was very much sort of, well, at least my perception of it was like, people are tolerating me. I appear
Mm.
to be all right at my job, so it's fine as long as I don't drop the ball. But to be sort of um, welcomed and advocated for was really, it meant a lot.
I guess this is where too we need to shine a light more on the autistic gifts and how
Mm.
actually the fact that you're autistic could make you excel at your job and give you an upper hand, as opposed to it always being
Mm.
assumed
Yeah,
that that would be a deficit, and therefore, as long as you can keep the balls in the air, it's fine.
yeah,
you
yeah.
know would you have anything that you would want to share with someone who may have always going through a similar experience to you, or resonate with your story?
I mean, I think that the one of the things about, sorry, Asha,
Mm.
one of the things about it is that it is such a, it's such a personal thing. Like what's right for you at a particular point in time might not be right for you in a month's time. So it's difficult to sort of, I'd never advise someone, you should disclose your identity to your
Mm.
workplace or something, because it's, that might be right for you at a particular time. It might be wrong. But the one sort of like overarching piece of advice I'd have would be about self-compassion. I think that there is, regardless of what you're going through, there is always a place for self-compassion,
Yeah.
particularly when you've more than likely spent most of your childhood and adulthood not being on the receiving end of a lot of self-compassion, and often not being on the receiving end of a lot of sort of compassion generally.
Mm.
um, it is really, like it's a very magical thing. You can do so much more once you've just sort of got that headspace. Um, and the other, I mean, one of the things I do get sort of asked by parents of autistic kids a lot is whether or not it's worthwhile seeking a diagnosis, or, they're worried that a label will affect their kid's identity, or um, they might get bullied at school or something if they have that label. And that's something else that I would probably be, very consistently passionate about, is that, they're already going to have a label. Like, they will get labels. It is much better to have a label that fits, and a label that comes with tools that will help, as opposed
Mm.
to labels like lazy or weird, or um, a bit of a freak, or, I'm not saying your kid's like that, not you specifically, but the viewer's kid is like that.
Yeah.
But they're all things that I've heard about myself growing up. And the label autistic comes with things you can do to help about it, whereas the label weird does not,
Mm.
or lazy does not. Um, those levels aren't helpful. But yeah.
I love that message. I think that's so beautiful because, like you say, and I guess this too is where, if we change the way we think about the diagnosis
Mm,
of autistic, um, little side note, I was talking to someone the other day about
mm,
how, on diagnostic criteria reports that we receive, things like that, we see
mm,
ASD, autism spectrum disorder. And so
mm,
in that, there's this implication that this person is disordered.
mm,
Um, and I think maybe that needs a shake up in itself, because while
mm,
autistic people do have challenges within a society that is geared for a neurotypical brain, and therefore deserve and
mm,
require support and understanding and compassion,
mm,
I think there's not enough focus on the gifts that can come with this, and understanding that
mm,
perhaps in getting a diagnosis of autism and getting that label, we're actually giving a child a sense of belonging to a community or to a group of people that share in their their passions, their hyperfixations, their, what, or their particular way of socializing. Perhaps they don't want to make eye contact. Perhaps they'd rather socialize by sitting next to someone, sharing
yeah.
an activity that doesn't involve communication, or like whatever it might be,
Mm,
but that they're not alone, and that they're
yeah.
not weird, and that they're not, less than in any way, shape, or
Mm.
form.
Yeah, I
Um,
completely agree with that. It's really valuable to just know what's going on. Um,
yeah, yeah. I think for me too, like I always felt like I was weird growing
mm,
up, and I could never put my finger on it. I was always like, I didn't know how I was weird. I just knew that I didn't quite get a lot of stuff that was going on around me. Like
mm,
socially, I was like, I just don't get it, but I'm just gonna go along with it
yeah,
because everyone else seems to be going along with it.
yeah,
Right. And then when I
mm,
grew up, and it took me into like well into my adulthood to be like, there are other people like me,
yeah,
you know? And all of a sudden,
yeah.
it was like, actually, I'm not broken.
Mm.
How liberating is that?
And just, yeah, a lot of the little things that just come with it, uh, about, that you just stop beating yourself up for. Like, um, I think one of the really silly ones was I used to get really, and this is, yeah, this is very discreet, but I used to get really stressed about going to Subway because I was, at one time I had this experience where they didn't put enough sausage, put enough salami on my Subway, and just that anxiety of like, um, what if they do it again? What if it doesn't line up properly? And then when I got my diagnosis, I was like, well, I'm just going to give myself permission to not be angry at myself for getting stressed that maybe the salami won't line up.
Yeah.
For accepting that whether or not the salami lines up is something that occupies my headspace, just cause it doesn't, it doesn't mean that I'm a
Mm,
bad person, but it's just something that is weird and specific to me, and I can just leave it there and accept that that's something that causes me stress. Um, and there are so many things like that, like tags on clothing, and
mm,
needing to change halfway through a dinner party because I'm wearing something uncomfortable. Um, Being able to just, the conversation that you have in your head along the lines of, yep, that's something I'm finding difficult because of my autism. I'm just going to go and change, as opposed to being halfway through a dinner party and not concentrating on what's being said, and then beating yourself up because you're not concentrating on what's being said, and not really permitting yourself to just have your own sensory thing, deal with it and move
mm,
on.
mm.
um it just eliminates so much stress and so many, yeah, so much time spent, um worrying, why are these little things bothering me? I should be above this.
Yeah. Yeah. I feel like there's a real message here about self-acceptance and compassion, and also that uniqueness and authenticity in like honoring everything in its own time.
Mm,
When the individual is ready for something, or isn't ready for something, or
Mm.
however that process unfolds, um, and a message to all people,
Mm.
to, I suppose, have compassion and an openness to allowing people to show up differently based on what makes them feel more comfortable, rather than us all expecting a kind of cookie cutter approach to
Mm.
existing. I don't
Mm.
know.
Yeah, I think that's good for everybody.
Yeah,
Mm.
yeah.
Mm.
But yeah, is there anything else that you wanted to share, or while we've got this time and this platform, if there's anything that you wanted to share with people before we wrap up?
Um, I mean, I think we've covered a lot of it, really. It's something I think, I mean, at least for me, neurodiversity is something to be happy about.
Mhm.
It's something to be proud about, and it certainly makes the world a lot more interesting. And a lot of the stuff that we have that we enjoy probably wouldn't exist without neurodivergent people.
Yeah.
Um, and yeah, I think it's a good thing. It's not a negative.
Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree with you. I mean, most, I will say, of my favorite people in this world are neurodivergent, and
Mm.
I learn from them every day, whether it's through
Mm.
my profession or through my daughter.
Mm.
um I find, even being able to see different perspectives from different autistic
Mm.
minds or neurodivergent people, so beautiful, like to just open up, I
Mm.
guess, our realms of reality.
It's yeah, it's certainly an experience that I've had in like a group of neurodiverse
Mm.
people where um you don't align, like no one has exactly the same set of issues.
Yeah, yeah.
but sort of existing in a space where like one person, it's really important to have like a lot of color, and another person needs absolute quiet, and the third person really needs to info dump about something, and how just collectively, I think my experience of neurodivergent people is that they're all happy to make space for
Mm,
each other's things,
yes.
um, and that space often ends up feeling so much more comfortable and welcoming as a result. Not to mention interesting.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I love that sense of really being able to be your authentic self, and not having to be the
Mm.
same as other people in order to feel
Mm.
safe and accepted within a group of people.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I love that. Thank you so much for being here and for sharing so openly about your experiences. I really think that you're such an inspiring person.
Thank you. Yeah.
And it's been so wonderful to connect with you. And I hope that we'll be able to, I don't know, do something like this again in the future and
Mm.
explore some more stuff.
Yeah, that'd be
So
great.
thank you. So
Mm.
thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.